As you realized yesterday, the divisions of labor between myself and Professor Schmidt has a little bit collapsed, partly because we come from the same background. We are two empirical researchers working in contiguous field, basically arrived at the same point at the same time. So we literally, I literally wish I could have said the things that Professor Schmidt said in the same nice way, and I hope it was reciprocal. So what I'm saying is that the divisions of labor today, this morning, this afternoon, is a bit blurred. So the things that I said this morning apply again for general research, and the things that Professor Schmidt will say this afternoon applies not only to general sociology, but also to localized area of social science, like organization studies. So for those of you who were not here yesterday, and I think we put off a few people who didn't come back, most of the day yesterday was about establishing the meaning of the word introduced by Professor Schmidt, which I think describes the project we are discussing here in the best way. So how praxiologize an object of inquiry. So how to use this particular, what I call the family of approaches to praxiologize a phenomenon, okay? And what we have been proposed yesterday is that in order to do so, we have to utilize together an ontological orientations that we discussed in some length yesterday, both morning and afternoon. We explored both the general feature of these orientations and also some of the challenges in terms of how to deal with normativity, how to deal with ethics, how to deal with other aspects. But however, yesterday we were very clear that the challenge here is not only to have this idea, the challenge then to find ways, so then we find practical way, so to praxiologize, so to use methods that actually praxiologize things and cut the world in terms of practices or activities or activity systems, and not something else. The challenge is that of finding ways that actually are authentic to the ontological assumptions, because it's very easy to have a great idea in theory and then in the practice just end up in a very old place. And I suggested yesterday there's also an issue of how to write practice. I believe that the last point will be clarified by Professor Schmidt, who actually takes writing as a case study, but also has, as you heard, will show how you can describe academic writing as an exercise of understanding how writing practice is not only about looking what people do, but also reporting in writing for others to understand. So what I'm going to try to do this morning is to present you with the current state of the art of people who, in mine and other contiguous community, work in practice theory, and how do they solve the practical problem of what do I do next as researcher. So if I want to praxiologize my object of inquiry, which strategy do I use? You can call them which research design you use, okay, as we'll see. So the idea is, what do I look for when if I want to end up with a social reality made of practices, okay? And I have to say that the things that I will discuss come from my active involvement in the community of organization studies, which also sociology of work, as it used to be called before sociology went out of business or out of fashion. And, but I have to say that some of this practice approach has been embraced widely in a variety of fields. There is a very thriving community, of course, in social science of studies and technology, where I believe all this started. Feminist studies, but also economics has a thriving program of research on the social constitutions of markets, mostly with people of second generations actor and actor theory. And then area where you never heard, education has a strong line of work on practice approaches. International relations. International relations has embraced practice-based approaches. Administration theory, policy making, marketing, project management. There's an interest in everywhere in praxiologizing their object of inquiry, okay? And see what things new you can find out. I have to say that in some of these fields, praxiologizing is really revolutionary. Some of these fields will very often operate in the past without theory, which means just utilizing the common sense, methodological, individualist ontology that comes with the neoliberal dominant ideology in which we all live and we hear on the televisions and all day. So in many quarters, the idea that actually international relations are not the applications of policy decided at the UN, but actually a patience working of people, things, a networking and noting. It's been just refreshing, opening minds. In some fields like mine, practice theory has made slightly less the news because in the study of sociological study of work and organizations, how do you say, a processualizing process of the object of inquiry has happened over the years. Just to make clear, until about 20 years ago, if you were going to take a class in organization studies or sociology of organizations, you would be taught that organizations are like living systems. So there are things, and the idea was to understand the nature of organization. Some of you actually may remember this. You were taught system theory of one type of another. About 20 years ago, organization scholars who have been, because they live in between fields, have the freedom of being a little bit more creative than others, have already decided that talking about organizations as static things in the world was not very helpful. And they moved toward the study of organization. Organizations is the ordering, so as a process. And a lot of people took very seriously what we call the linguistic turn. Okay, a lot of people went linguistic. So organizing, making people work together is done by talking, by conversations, by things. So the practice approach arrived when the terrain was already prepared. And just remind people that doing organization and organizing is not something that you do by people talking in the same room or through discourse. There are other elements involved, and you heard yesterday, partly from myself, partly from Professor Schmidt, bodies, artifacts, objects, rules, all these things are involved in keeping people together. So once you have accepted this praxeology, or you have been curious enough to explore what the praxeologist approach can do for you, okay? So once you have bought the ticket, okay, and you said, okay, very interesting. Now you just enter the theater. So at the methodology, used to say, that you buy the ticket, you enter, but then you have to start the show. And then when you enter the ticket, everybody else in the room is all, okay, we all agree that we need to look at the world as a network of practices. We all need, so how do you do it? Okay, so how do you do it? So what I'm going to do in the next 40 minutes, I'm going to try to share with you 4 strategies that people have used and are currently using to put in practice the principles and the assumptions of practice theories. And I'm going to suggest that people have done this by taking 4 orientations, okay? We will call this situational, genealogical, configuration, and dialectical. So these are 4 ways that alone or combined, so it's not either or, alone or combined can be used to praxeologize and have been used to praxeologize the objects of inquiry. Both organizations, okay, these 4 are used in organization studies and contiguous, but by definitions, also other objects of inquiry. So you will see that the example actually they use is an example that actually straddles between organization studies and education. It'd be nice if you move. Okay. So the first, and I think more obvious way to start the inquiry into, to start tackling social phenomena in a praxiologically oriented way is that of taking a situational orientations. What does it mean? It means that you attend the concerted accomplishment of orderly scenes of actions. And you study how this particular scene of action, okay, is reproduced. We have discussed this at length yesterday, okay? This is mostly what we're talking about yesterday. This, we said, or I tried to say more than once, and I apologize, it's the end of the day, we start repeating ourselves a little bit, that one of the critical innovations of the practice approach, whatever you want to call it, is putting real-time ordinary activity at the core of the explanations of social phenomena. On the assumption that was clearly explained by Professor Schmidt using the example of football, but we could have used the example of gift giving, then many times if you are not there to observe the actions, you will not capture the strategy, tactics, worries, emotions, options that were open to the practitioner at the point of actions. All these things disappear and look very different when the action has been taken. If you remember my mouse, okay, if you put yourself in the shoes of the mouse has a split microsecond to decide in which of the two cues to go. If you want to study cues or cueing, okay, you cannot just go and talk people after how you do. You have to go and look what the mouse is doing. And that's why I think that little cartoon is so powerful. Because it is a study, okay? Remember, that is a representation. It's not a video, okay? That is an artist who tried to capture the reality of deciding in which cue you go in a very humoristic way. So the first place, and somebody says, somebody said that this is the appropriate first place to start praxiological oriented studies is to start with a scene of actions. Go and see what people do, okay? And Latour used the expressions starting in the middle, okay? And some strides used to say, go and start where the action is. And the reason is that we said yesterday using Pierre Bourdieu is that if you're not at some point referring to these things, you may miss something. Although we'll see in a minute, there are other options. What are we talking here? So what are we talking about scene of actions? In the case of my community of organizations, that means going in a place where the action is, okay? You can go and, okay? So places where practices intersect and meet. A meeting, an office, a shop floor, a restaurant, an emergency room. So going places where things happen and observing how the things unfold. Let's make an example here. Okay. So let's imagine that we are studying the making of a class. So remember yesterday, my suggestion is that one of the tricks, of the linguistic tricks of praxeology is that of not using the word, let's go and study education. Remember, that's what we learned, what was from the bureaucracy example. My suggestion is that instead of saying studying bureaucracy, let's go study queuing, but also making a case, preparing a file, having a meeting, giving order, writing a piece of law. So you break, so that bureaucracy or institutions becomes a network of actions, all tied together. So if you want to study education, you can study educations. You can study the practices that make up educations. And one of the core practices that make up educations is doing a class. It's not teaching. Teaching is a variety of, the dispersion teaching encompasses a number of practices. Doing a class, marking, encountering parents, at least in this country. In other countries includes, for example, writing your own handbooks, like in this place here. This teacher here actually has to write. They don't have books, so the teacher writes the books that she gives to the teachers, okay? So doing a class. So what it means to actually going and studying, doing a class? What sort of questions, what sort of things will I be go and look? So the first thing is going to do how doing a class is done in real time. So what are the doings and sayings? What this teacher says and does, okay? And then you can start asking yourself, what other sayings and doings could be said? Or for example, how do this doing the class will change if some of the elements in the class change? If the kids change, if the technology changes, if the artifacts changes, right? We can start to ask the questions that we were discussing yesterday afternoon at length in terms of meaning. So, how do participants understand and perform this practice, okay? So how do the teacher and the students understand what doing a class is? And are these understanding aligned? Do they have the same understanding? Okay? You may have a teacher that has one idea of how class should go, and the kids have a different idea how class should go, and I leave it to you to imagine what happens if the kids start to jump on the tables because they think that that's what you're doing in class. Okay? So they will have to be disciplined. And then we can ask other questions that we were seeing yesterday. So what materials are involved? Okay, in which way material and artifacts are actually involved in producing class? Look behind me this picture, okay? Think of the classes where your kids go and see how they, what type of different doing class they support. But look also at the desks. It's very interesting. The desk seems to be one of those artifacts that enters, and we'll see in a minute, they doing the class in a variety of places and create a certain type of schooling, well, okay? And we can also ask sort of what sort of discipline bodies are involved, okay? So where do we learn the doing of being a pupil? You've been taught how to be a pupil since you were a small child. And yesterday we were talking about Paul Willis and the sociologists of education who have made clear relationship between training how to be a pupil and training how then to be a disciplined worker in factories and disciplined citizens. So the idea is understanding practice by going in a scene of actions and attending on how this scene of action is produced in practice and how it's reproduced every day. Oops, not good. Good. So what methodological resources have been used to do this? So if you remember yesterday, I gave you an image of a flower, okay, as a palette of, like, the palette is the things that the painters have with all the colors. The flowers has many petals, so you have to pick the petals that are more useful. This is probably all methodology that you are more or less familiar with. The idea is that you use in methodology, established methodology, we don't invent anything new that can be used in order to understand organizations or work or social phenomena as they happened. Real-time observations, video methods. One of the methodology I've been working and developing in the last few years is shadowing. Shadowing is basically just following the actors, either human or non-human. So you can also shadow documents, shadow products, technologies. Although somebody says it's no shadow, is following, but that's another story. for extended period of time. So not just a few minutes, but sort of following them for days, weeks, even months. I just finished a piece of work when we followed some workers for 1 month each. Okay. An interesting trick here is that very often in order to see how the accomplishment of these scenes of actions, the best place to go is when these scenes of actions break down. So breakdowns mean something goes wrong. The reason is that very often, as we heard yesterday, the practitioners are not aware of most of the things they do because that is the role of tacit knowledge. And so they're not very good at telling you what's going on. And it's only when something goes wrong, people have to stop and reweave the textures of the practices. And so you see the texture yourself. Another place to go, and I like particularly the second one, because of course breakdown is not a good place to be, always because we know, well, I know because I've done a lot of work on learning from incidents. When breakdowns happen, a lot of emotions come into place. So it's very difficult to do research and to untangle emotions from the rest. So socializations is a very good place. So if you want to learn how a scene of actions is set, try to become an apprentice. And the reason is that apprentice has the nice, as we know from the situated learning, has the nice is a nice position of being authorized to ask the silly questions. So if you introduce yourself as a learner in any situations, the expert will feel the need to explain you what's going on. So they will actually, and of course you have to listen, but not take anything the practitioner says for at face value, because they will. And again, there's a lot of literature about this, but it's a great place to be in order to shed light. So go and see for yourself, try to capture some breakdowns, and then if possible, try to go through the socializations. This gives you a very good insight in what it gets into the productions of situated scene of actions, okay? And that is one way of responding to the questions. If I want to study the world as made of practices, where do I start? We'll come back. I have another about until 10:40. Okay. So as you can see, there is no interview here. We'll come back to the role of interviews and this vexed problem of interview yes or no at the end. And I think we're going to spend a lot of time this afternoon. Traditionally speaking, in research traditions like ethnomethodology and some ethnography, this is it. Studying practices is study the orderly accomplishment of scenes of actions. And my questions, the reasons why I go around, my question is, why in the name of God we should reinvent the wheel when ethnomethodologists and the last about 10 years, video ethnomethodologists had developed the most sophisticated toolkit for how to do it, how to study, how to transcribe, how to analyze videos, how to think of the accomplishment of scene of action in terms of sequences. And they have not only a toolkit, they also have a whole disciplinary repertoire on how to do analysis, and how, remember, Charles Antaki reminds us that doing analysis of practice means doing analysis, okay? Very often, as we'll see at the end, doing practice theory is just considered just giving sort of superficial descriptions of how things are done. My suggestions and the view of many practice theories, which in this way becomes an extension, something new, that practice theories starts with the scenes of action, but says if the world is made of scenes of actions, we need to do something else. So the practice theory has 3 other cards in the shelves, 3 other strategies. They make says, if you want sort of like an extended ethnography, you can give it whatever name, but this is where practice approaches start to be interesting and different from others. The second thing is that a different way for praxiologizing the objects of inquiry is taking a genealogic view, okay? In the first instance, remember, whenever you're going to scene of actions, you always see many practices coming together. We said yesterday, the first thing is that the practice of the researchers and the practice of the practitioners. We had the discussions about this and the fact that the practitioner himself is carrying a practice in a scene. So even if you are alone, you always have, with the one practitioner, you always have two practices, never one. We discussed yesterday in terms of the positioning, the assumption. But if you're going to a place like in a class, if you're going to a place like a waiting room, in a cafe, in a restaurant, you find a lot of practices coming together. Okay, so a second strategy that has been used successfully is that of isolating a particular regime of activity and doing something that colleagues from like Elizabeth Shove, Mika Panzer call entitizing, so taking provisionally the regime of actions as an object of inquiry, a thing, okay, and studying the natural life of this thing. So studying how the practice, okay, emerge, are perpetuated, and disappear. Okay. You can do the same with the scene of actions. You can sort of isolate class, the doing a class, and do it the same, asking yourself how the doing a class has come, okay, to be historically constituted in this way, okay? And the third thing that you can ask not only how individual practices travel in time, but also in space. So how come we go in Africa, and if you find that a class like this looks very similar to a class that will happen here around the corner. Okay, there will be desk, a teacher in front, and pupil more or less disciplined sitting behind. How did we get there? Okay, who brought it there? And these are all questions that can be answered not by going into the clouds and using categories like classes and structure systems. You can just go and see who were the Dutch travelers and priests who went to Africa in this particular place, who set up the first school and taught the first generations. I'm sorry, I'm saying Dutch because you had a great empire. I could have said British, but okay. So you can trace these things in a practice way, not in terms of what is the colonial principle that went around. Colonialism, like teaching, like bureaucracy, comes down to people getting on board of a boat, more or less willingly, some pushed, okay, some desperate, going places and do horrible things. So the idea is like yesterday, bureaucracy is breaking down the big stories into small stories that we can trace empirically. Let's go back to nothing. Let's go back to our class, okay? So while we're thinking here, we can ask ourselves, when and how was the modern practice of doing a class assembled? Okay, when did people started to do class the way we're doing? We know that in ancient Greece, the class didn't exist. People were usually meeting in the agora or walking around in the peripatetic schools, okay? So at what point, okay, the idea that doing class means sitting behind a desk took shape, okay? And what other elements were brought into it? For those who are interested in this type of projects, the recent book, The Dynamic of Social Practice by Shove, Panzer, and Smith is particularly interesting. They sort of provide a language for studying this. So I urge you to go and look at their stuff. And they will tell you, because they said these stories about other practice like driving, that at the beginning in the medieval time, okay, there was a borrowing of the practice of attending mass to the practice of teaching. So, okay. So you sit behind the desk when you attend mass, then you can sit. So the preaching as a model was transferred in education, okay. I'm actually studying now the emergence of a new practice in the Bay Area with my students in real time, who saw that people were sort of like passing. Some of the things that in this company they were doing all the time when doing programming, the same idea they were doing what is called pair programming two people instead of one in front of the computer for reasons that doesn't. Now this sort of like this particular model has spilled over into other activities. So in this company, everything is done in pairs. Okay, and so we are looking at how the spillover happened. So you can ask which other practices were put together in order to do a class historically. Other questions that you can ask is how do this way of doing class recruited participants? Okay, we're talking practices here. Remember, the idea is not to start with asking how did teachers became such, but how do the doing class became diffused go around the world. So the question is how this particular way of doing schooling went around the world and started to enroll participants, okay? And what other ways of doing classes were weeded out? So when this way of doing class started to emerge, what alternatives were actually sort of like eliminated? And if you are in education, you know that over the years, over the centuries, there were alternative way of doing schooling, okay? I can mention the Steiner tradition. I'm sure you have your own homegrown traditions of doing class which does not include having pupils sitting behind the desk, okay? And so why is these things, what are the practical way in which these things have been eliminated? It's been cut out, okay? There was no divinity who one day came and says, thou shalt do class in this way, okay? This has happened as a result of historical process that is subject to empirical study. So you can study this. So you can study both how the emergence and the hegemonic view, okay, and you can go and read Ivan Illich if you like old stuff, okay, and why. So you can study, you can pontificate about how, pontificate about why doing class in this way became hegemonic. But you can also go in and be patiently reconstructing how it happens. You know, how does this particular way of doing class arrive in Africa and eliminated other indigenous way of doing classes? In Australia, this is an amazing problem because the Aborigines Australians had their own completely different way of sharing knowledge with their next generations. You may have heard about the songwriters, and so the arrival of the Western way of doing these things had created an amazing problems. Okay. And of course, by the same token, you can start how doing class evolve over time. How the technology evolve, how the doing and saying evolve, okay? And yeah. Why do I have that? Oh, yes. Sorry, I'm looking. I had a picture of a teacher spanking one of the pupils, okay? So I think none of this in these rooms is sort of old enough to have gone to school where corporal punishment were still acceptable. The first generation before, yes. My father, yeah, somebody shaking their hands. I was trying to be polite. Okay. So, what methodological resources you can use? Okay, so the best thing to do this, the best things is to study practice in the making, so longitudinal studies. So you accompany a practice in time. And some people are lucky enough to be able to capture the practice at some point in time and follow their evolution, okay? Your PhD is 3 years. In America, even longer. So if you are really skilled and really lucky, you actually see the speed. Usually you see a segment. I had the luck many years ago to capture telemedicine as it was just starting. And I accompanied telemedicine in northern Italy for about 2 years, okay? And then, unfortunately, with the heartbreak, I had to abandon it. But actually, I know anthropologists who have been studying the same practice for all their life. They keep on going to the same hospital, the same tribe, they keep on going to the same class or same school over and over. And this becomes sort of like a way of following the practice. If you're not lucky enough or don't have resources enough, the second options is doing historical analysis. And we have here, I think, an historian or somebody who was doing history of sort of studying the practices in the past. Was studying the practices of art in Renaissance, is that correct? And we said yesterday, you can hold on to this praxiologizing of the object of inquiry if you study the past, okay? You can study doing a class in the medieval time. We have pictures, we have artifacts, we have stories. You cannot study the expertise of teachers because that requires being there, okay? So you cannot claim that you are able to look at the ethnomethods, look at the teachers. You can't. You cannot look at the methods, meaning of people if you're not there with them. But you can still try to make sense of some of the phenomena of doing class and making connection between the doing class and divisions of labors or sort of, by going back and not asking what were the values in the medieval time, but how did people set in class, okay? We have it. If you go to Stratford-upon-Avon, I live very close to Stratford-upon-Avon, which is Shakespeare town. Some of the tour guides tell you the stories of how Shakespeare was behaving in class, okay? And how the different behavior in class then meant that people would take different paths in life. The people from the guilds, do you know what the guild is? Yes, you have guilds, same words here. People of the guilds will come to the class and ask to the teacher who are the best behaved pupils, and those who were selected to become guild members. So you can start making this connection. So this is what we're talking about in terms of praxiologizing the past, so to speak. And the one thing that I recommend very useful is playing with time horizons. Ron Scollon, a scholar which, of which you were going to hear more, although he died a few years ago, was suggesting that doing social science makes a lot of difference if you take as a span of research 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 days, or 5 years. You literally see different things, okay? So you can study the evolutions of a practice, the reproduction. So in 5 seconds, you can study how the practice is reproduced here and now. Okay, in 5 years, you have a different breadth. So play with time horizons. The third strategy, we're getting there. Okay. The third strategy is what I call configurational orientations. And this will start to move to the idea that studying one practice at a time is very interesting, is very powerful, is very rewarding for those who do it, but only give us a partial view of social phenomena because, by definition, partial organizational phenomena, and especially the phenomena I deal with, so large organizations, institutions, large conglomerates, action nets or work nets, okay? Sort of imagine a factory or a large, a university, okay? It's difficult to think of the university as a practice, so there's no such a thing as doing university. As we were saying yesterday, praxiologizing means thinking the university of the result of a coming together of a big assemblage, bundle, combinations of practices like doing a class, marking, etc., and a number of discursive practices that then try to encompass this. So the idea here is that the third way to do, okay, and as I said at the beginning, these strategies are kept separate for analytical purpose because this, okay, you can do them together, one after the other, or instead of the other, it's up to you. So the third thing is to focus not on individual scenes of actions, okay, so how the practice manifests itself in one place and time, Not in terms of how that particular regime of actions has evolved over time, but how regimes of activities hang together, how they work together, how they form knots, bundles, constellations, and how they, what artifacts keep them together, and what are the effect of this? What are, with a particular focus, as we mentioned yesterday, to the empowering effects. So what happens when the practice come together? What do they form? Let's go back to our class, okay? You can study doing a class individually, okay? And then you can start doing a class when the doing a class encounters the practice of management. I don't know if there's any scholars here of institutions or policy science. This is called new public management. In the 1990s, a lot of practices encounter the practice of management through the new public management. And the two practices had to start be weaved together. And a lot of things happened. And some of you, if you're not already experiencing what new public management does to the practices of being a university professor or doing university professor, you will discover soon, okay? Sorry? It's here? Good, I thought so. So it's very much in my institutions. So you can moan, you can complain, you can give an ideological explanation of this, or you just can ask what happens when practices are bounded together, okay? What happened well, we'll see this afternoon. What happened to the practice of academic writing? What happened to the class of the practice of doing a class? So, question that you can ask, okay, when you start the coming together of classes, the coming together of practices. One first obvious question that I like to ask always is that doing a class is what I call the moment of truth. So doing a class is actually happens or doesn't happen when a lot of practices come together, okay? So in order to have a class, you have to have a teacher and pupils. So you have already, but you also have to have somebody who have opened the school, okay? You have somebody who has enrolled the student. You have somebody who has brought the student to the school. And if you start to go backward, you can also need to have somebody who provides the power for the lights because it's winter, otherwise it's dark. And somebody who have actually constructed the chairs, and somebody who has delivered the chair. So you can see that doing a class is coming together of all these things. And if one of these things is not aligned, okay, so doing a class is not really an act or network, but is a coming together of a network. If one of the things is not aligned, for example, if the people at the nearby power stations decided to go on a holiday and turn the off, there is no light and there is no class. The students have to go home, okay? If there is a strike in the transport systems, there is no teacher. One of the practices don't show up in the scene of actions. Okay? So the first thing you can do is actually asking yourself, what are the dependency between these practices, how they tie together, okay? The second thing that you can ask is, what are the type of associations? What goes into keeping these things together? Are they simply happening in the same place? Okay, for example, teaching and having a cafeteria, okay? Manuel de Landa talks about relationship of exteriority and interiority. So there are some associations which can or cannot happen. Some associations are interdependency. So if you have a teacher, but you don't have a class, then you have a problem, okay? Or you can start asking when and how these practices have been orchestrated. So who decided that doing a class is going to do in a class in a particular way? Okay, where, are the different ways of doing a class again aligned? Or there is a misunderstanding or a conflict, but we come back to this. And also, we can start asking, what is the work of bodies and objects in keeping these practices together? Okay, look at these chairs and look at this room. You will find that a lot of the practices of doing a conference or doing a class is already inscripted in the architecture of the place. Okay? The fact that I speak your silence is inscripted in the positions. So we don't have to, when you came in, we didn't have to explain that there will be a speaker and there will be listeners. A lot of the things is done by the object here. Okay? So doing a seminar, so to speak, doing a class, is done not only by the teachers, is not only based by human relations between each other, objects, and of course discipline bodies, because if any of you start to tap on the chair, I'm sure that Franz will stand up and say, excuse me, sit down, and if you insist, you will have to find a polite way of chaperoning you out. So don't do it, okay? But you will not do it because you're taking within yourself the practice of listening in your discipline bodies. You shifted in this particular practice. You've been taught since you were children like this, that when the teacher speaks, you have to be silent. And it doesn't have to be like this. Okay. Methodological resources for doing this. I have another 6 or 7 minutes. Is that okay? Okay. I have proposed in the past a method that is sort of like basically going from place to place, tracing connections. I gave it the beautiful name zooming in and zooming out because I thought that the name would capture the imaginations, and it did. Okay? It was not a new idea, but the word did it. So helped sometimes. I had the assistance of one of my friends for marketing. So zooming in and zooming out means simply that in order to make sense of these assemblages, okay, you don't take a panoramic view, because then if you take the view from above, you start seeing structures. So you go into a class and you say, okay, if this class depends on the work of the administrators, I will go to the office of the administrators. The idea of the zooming in and zooming out is that in order to understand how practices are related, you don't all of a sudden jump on the sky and say they are related because there is some structure behind them, or there are some plan behind them, or there are some divine plan behind them, or there are some logic guide them, or there are some social mental map. Okay, no. Doing a class is tied to the administrator by the fact that the administrators will go and talk to the class. That the teacher will be told, there will be meetings between the teacher and the head teacher, in which the head teacher will tell teacher things to create expectations. So you go to the meeting where the head teacher speaks to the teacher, okay? If you want to know how the doing class is connected with having children arriving on time, okay, you will go and see how children are brought to school. You may have to go and ask some of the parents if they can drive from school to home and see if they use the bicycle or the car. So what I'm trying to say is that zooming in and out is not just going above and taking this, what philosopher Nagel called the glance from nowhere. It means simply connecting patiently one place from another, always looking for nothing but ordinary actions. Okay? Again, this is a little bit old, as I said. Multi-sided ethnography has been doing this for many years. Okay, so multi-sided ethnography has the toolkit. Other ways to doing this is what Ron Scollin called circumferencing. The circumference is the circle, so it's going around the circle, but of course, going around the circle is not something you say in academia, so you have to say circumferencing. But it's basically the idea is that you follow the connections between ways of doing. We're talking about ways of doing, okay, doing things. And in order to follow, Ron Scholar was a communication scholar, so he was very attentive to how communications connect things. But he was praxiologically oriented enough to know that communication alone cannot do it. So he was suggesting to look for what he calls resemiotization. Is it there? Yes. Resemiotization is another difficult word for thinking that sometimes actions change form, they change substance. No divinity involved here, no mass involved. Transubstantiation. The results of the meeting become a piece of paper that then travels to another meeting and make things happen. So the result, one meeting made itself present in another meeting. And in the meeting is transubstantiated, is changed into talk. And the talk becomes another paper, some actions, some artifacts. If you call, for example, if you do the same things with the pizza place, okay, your order is resemiotized in a beautiful smelling pizza, then somebody will deliver to your house. So that's good resemiotization, okay? So the suggestion is that the idea of resemiotization helps you following a practice, not only as it happens, but in its manifestations and in its representatives. Sort of, it's what the actor-nectar people will call the mobiles, okay, the mutable translators, and how it goes around. And so in this way, you can start seeing how different actions are knotted together, not like a knot, how textures of actions are weaved together. Oops, oh, this here was, sorry, it went out of place. Finally, okay, but not least, there's a fourth way. So remember, we are going to I'm responding to the questions, how can we study the world from a practice perspective? Not how we study practices, how do we praxeologize the objects of inquiry? And my suggestion is that the fourth approach we can use is taking a dialectical orientations, which means studying the dynamics of the association between practice. So we have studied individual practice, we have studied their life story, we have studied how they come together. Yesterday somebody was saying that there is always the risk of looking at practices and assemblages of practice in a harmonious way. I think the professor left, okay? No, there is no need to do that, and I think, again, this afternoon, I think it was Robert Schmidt that was said yesterday. The importance of looking at how people criticize. I think it's going to come this afternoon. Sorry. We read each other the stuff, so the confusions. So it's important as that we also look not only at how assemblages are made, okay, and but also how assemblages don't hang together, okay, and we ask ourselves, what are the internals? Oh, yes. We ask ourselves, what are the tension between practices, okay? We focus on the evolution, conflict, and interference between the practices. We focus on the empowerment effect of the practices. This is why this was here, okay? So, doing class in a way or another, okay? Put somebody in charge and give authority, okay? The authority of the teachers is tied historically to a particular way of doing classes. So by doing the direct associations, we also need to ask ourselves and remind ourselves that these particularly associations of practices is necessarily located in time and space. Okay? And we can start asking ourselves, what are historical conditions? So doing class is always historically located in this network of other practices. And we can ask ourselves how things could be different, how things were different. What are the historical things that keep this practice in place? And yesterday, in our tables, I was sort of like suggesting the image of the wiring of history. In any point of history, every phenomenon has a lot of wires. And you can ask yourself, what are the wiring of this phenomenon and how the wiring could be different? Okay? So, dialectical orientations focus on internal tensions and focus on the coevolutions, conflict, and interference between different practices. So, question that you can ask again. So, first of all, as I said, who is empowered and disempowered by different types of network of associations? So, if you have one particular way of doing classes and another particular way of doing classes, who's the winners and who's the losers? I did studies, for example, of nurses, how nurses are empowered, disempowered by particular configurations of practices. And yesterday, during the discussions, I was making the example of the hospital versus the hospice as two arrangement of practices, institution we call them, okay, in which some of the practices are with a different way, and the identity of the patients, but also the identity of the nurses changes dramatically, okay? We can also start asking questions like, so what type of students are favored by a particular way of doing classes, okay? This particular way of doing classes give the heads-on to middle-class students who have been taught in school, okay? Who have been taught in their families how to sit properly at the table, okay? So you will see that particular assemblages of practice not only produce disempowerment between the actors, also favors one and the other. And a number of other questions, okay? So what subject positions, a form of agency are made available? Every agglomerate of practice produces certain possibility of actions. Okay. This particular form of agency is not acceptable in the current way of doing classes. Okay? So historically has changed, I hope. Okay? And I'm really sorry. I'm lost. I think some of my slides were out of order. And what alternative form of agency are possible? See, because once you start thinking the words in terms of action nets coming together, built together by somebody under certain historical conditions, you can start thinking differently, okay? And that's what innovators do. Okay? There is not only one way of doing classes. As I said, there are alternative traditions. And these alternative traditions are based on different practices. They probably also have some discursive practices that support them. I mentioned the Steiner tradition just because my daughter went to Steiner school for a while. But okay, they have a whole ideology. But fundamentally, they have a different way of doing schooling, which is radically different, or Montessori, or other, I work because I have a degree in education, so I used to work in a Dewey school, okay? So the way of doing classes was based on different principles, but fundamentally looked different. If you entered the school, the kids didn't know anything about the ideology, but they knew that this school is different from the last one I went. And other question that you can ask once you look at these assemblages of practice with a dialectic perspective is also, what are the tensions between different practices? Okay, you work a lot in hospital. I don't have to tell you about the tensions between the caring practices of the nurses and the scientific-oriented practice of the doctors. This is the reality every day. You know, the discussions, the fight between doctors and administrators are so well known, okay? The interesting thing is that traditions like activity theory remind us that anytime there is a serious conflict between two practices, there is an opportunity for innovation. So, okay, when something's done about it, the practice, the assemblage of practice, the way of doing class will start to evolve. Have you heard about MOOCs, right? The mass online open courses. Okay, this is a new way of doing class, which is coming our way. Okay, create tensions between existing things. The MOOCs is very likely to be, technologies in general, are going to very likely are, as we're speaking, creating contradiction between the old way of thinking of doing classes when you have people sitting here and the person speaking. Maybe, making the tables in a circle, a person speaking, okay? So the idea is that doing class in 50 years may look very different of how we're looking now, okay? And so introduction of new technology, introductions of new practices, assembling a practice that was not there into the existing one can produce innovations. And as I said, one of the great opportunity here is that if you start praxiologizing things, okay, if you bring these things from the sky to the tomato level, down to the ground, it's much easier to start thinking how things could be different. Okay. So this is where practice starts to gain a certain mild amount of critical power. Not critical powers in terms of proposing new view of society or but sort of a more practical way of finding ways of redesigning, okay, the making of everyday life and everyday ordinary life in a way that if you want, and that's what we discussed yesterday, some of the inequalities can be tackled if you want. So let's finish quickly, okay, by 3, again, open questions and 3 observations about the methodological orientations. So the first one is, are we just doing descriptive studies? The second question is, what is the role of direct observations? And the third one is, what type of theory are we going to produce? So if you use this strategy, okay, are we just doing observations and descriptions? Do we have to use ethnography? And what type of theory? We're going to be quite quick with this. So the first thing is that, as I said yesterday, it is in my, it is one of the risks that is becoming clear in my community, and being one of the community that have embraced this approach earlier than other is sort of like a glance in the future for those who are just starting. Okay? The first risk of praxiologizing the object of study and using these 4 approaches that I suggested is that you risk to fall into the idea that describing practices is all there is. Okay. And we mentioned yesterday this comes from the wrong assumption that practice is simply what people do. So you go in a place, you describe what people do, possibly in a way that the practitioner don't understand, and that's the end of the story. I called yesterday academic voyeurism, okay? But, and I suggested that this is misunderstanding. The practice approaches and praxiologizing the object of inquiry need to be at the service of explanations. Okay, you still need to come up with something different. You need to use these approaches to to give some understanding of something that we didn't understand before. The understanding could be, now I understand why the world is this way, not different. But just plainly describing what people do in itself, okay, can be extremely, how to say, problematic. And if there is any methodologist here, we can have a discussion after in terms of what is methodology for. Although, as I said yesterday, methodology has a secret agenda, which is instructability. Okay, so methodology is actually useful for a practitioner because methodology is a sophisticated analysis of how things are done to the point that practitioner can actually learn from that. But we can discuss this maybe later. The second thing is that taking this particular view that I suggested, studying the assemblage of practices, exposes you to the risk, which I see in my community, of treating practices as factors. So entitizing things in the practice are things that we can say there are this practice and this practice, these two practices are connected. Risk ourselves of basically exposing ourselves to a form of structuralism. So creating big depictions of what is the structure of practice, thank you. What is the architecture of practices? Looking at the university at this beautiful architectural practices, this is practice connected with these practices. That is not what practice is about. Remember, practice is understanding first and foremost how life is produced in real time. So studying practice is not studying object, but studying regimes of doings. Okay? So if you don't have time, as what we said yesterday, if you don't have time in a description of practice, you're doing something else. You're doing something else. And the third thing, as I said, there is a risk of banking of ignorance, just going back and just describe what people do in a superficial way. So using practice as reporting just mere activity in a behavioral way, okay? It's good because you don't know what a person repairing shoes does. But so cobbler. So if I go and do in practice-based studies of cobbling, and I come back and spend an hour and tell you how people repair the shoes, maybe you get all excited, you're really impressed, but just because you've never been in a cobbler shop. If the cobbler come here, he says, so what? I do this every day. So did you spend a whole year, your whole PhD, just to come to my shop and tell me things that I know already? Tell me something new. What is, okay? Second thing, what is the role of direct observations? I leave this for this afternoon. I wanted to say that observations, direct observation being there, has still a critical role into play. And the reasons have been explained very clearly by Professor Smith yesterday. Okay. However, and this comes from an ethnographer, so because this is what I do for a living, okay. If you accept, or if you think that the four approaches that I presented are all four different ways to praxeologize the object of, then there are different ways, okay? There are different ways of keeping faithful to the project of putting ordinary actions at the center of the inquiry. As we said, you cannot study the practice of schooling in the medieval time in real time because unfortunately we can't do that, okay? We can come back to this. And finally, what type of theory? As I said, I will leave to discussions on what type of theory and how to write practice to this afternoon. But I want to say that one of the ways in which you can betray the little man, the Bertolt Brecht, that history is done by little men, not by big men. This is what practice theory is about, okay? So one way of betraying the spirit and the basic ontological assumption that ordinary actions is actually at the core of the production and reproductions of everything social and other things, is that of going back and coming back with theory which are abstract and where action disappears. So you spend 3 years in the fields looking at people doing classes and what the object do and how classes is connected to administrations and what the new public management did. And then you come back and you provide a gigantic theory which has box and arrows about the problem, okay, in which you talk about grand theory of educations influenced by economic problems. And the actions all of a sudden is disappeared. So doing praxeology studies also require that we start to accept that theory can be done in a different way. And my suggestion is that we have to accept that theory can be done well. Okay? This is a different type of social theory. Okay? Social theory that is not based on abstractions, is not based on investigating, finding, construct, that operate behind the back of the actors, but is actually, theorizing, building upon, and through case study. So, so the recommendations, and this is something that both myself and Professor Smith are a little bit unhappy today, that we've been sort of put in a position where we're talking about practice theories in theory, okay? So in many ways, a good practice theory should come here and make you see the things that you heard today through a case study, which is something that I have to work because I'm not very good at it. Okay, the idea being that, as I said, Anne-Marie Moll, who lives just down the road from you, has written, okay? So crafting a rich theoretical repertoire does not work by laying out solid abstracting generalizations, but rather by adding together ever-shifting cases and learning from specificity. So practice theory is not only about using a new method, but also accepting a new ways of doing social theory, okay? Where the goal of social theory is that of accounting of the production, reproductions, and changes of social phenomena. And this can be done not by going to the sky and looking for abstract general principle, but can be done by learning, by the accumulations of local learning. How people do in classes, how people do in queuing, and how people doing classes and queuing are connected to form in institutions, and how institutions are connected to form the international orders, okay? All the time without taking shortcuts, okay? The way in which the United Nations works, the United Nations is not a big cloud in the sky. If you go into New York one day, okay, you discover the United Nations is just a building with 1 million people queuing, talking, doing meetings, passing paper, okay? I assure you, I spent a month in the office of a director of the largest hospital in England. These are companies with a 1 billion turnover, 22,000, okay? This is not a person sitting on the throne of dispensing. It's just a person who talks, writes, has meetings, queues, walks around. Ordinary actions, more ordinary actions, more ordinary actions. The world order is made of ordinary actions, okay? Praxiologizing is finding ways of staying authentic to this. Thank you.